In the summer of 1878, a man named Boyd Garnett never arrived anywhere without already having decided how it would end.
She had learned in 4 months on this mountain to pay attention to sounds that arrived before their cause.
He brought a lawyer, a court official, and a man hired to make silence feel like the only reasonable answer.
The courtroom in Harrow Creek was not a large room. It held maybe 60 people if they were willing to stand close together and breathe shallow. And on the morning of the 22nd of October, 1878, every one of those 60 spaces was filled. The air smelled of wool and wood polish, and the particular tension that collects in a room when something important is about to be decided. Wren Reardon stood at the respondent's table with her hat in her hands and her eyes on the judge's bench, and her face arranged in the expression it always wore when she had made a decision and was done reconsidering it. She was 19 years old and looked it, in the way that young women look their age when they have been working hard since childhood. The lines not yet accumulated, but the steadiness already there, earned rather than assumed. Her jaw was set, her shoulders were level. Beside her stood a tall man with dark hair and a coat that fit him imperfectly across the shoulders, and he was looking at the same bench with the same steadiness, and anyone watching the two of them would have understood without being told that whatever was about to happen, they had arrived at it together. The judge came in. Wren looked at her and thought, nearly 4 months. Nearly 4 months since the morning Garrett Reardon had come to her door in Harrow Creek with his hat in his hand and an arrangement already made. Nearly 4 months since she had stepped into a yard on a mountain she had never seen and looked at a man she had never met and decided, without knowing quite why, that she was going to pay attention to everything. Nearly 4 months since everything she had assumed about what her life was going to be had turned out to be beside the point entirely. The judge opened the case file. Wren looked down at her hands, then she looked up again. She did not look away. The summer of 1878 arrived in the Powder River country like something that had been waiting a long time and had finally stopped waiting. It came in June with heat that settled into the valley and stayed, pressing down on the cottonwood trees along the creek until their leaves went pale and papery, pressing down on the cattle in the lower pastures until they moved slowly and with enormous reluctance from shade to water and back again. By July, the creek itself had dropped 2 feet from its banks, and the mud at the edges had cracked into patterns that looked like something trying to hold itself together and failing. Black Spur Ridge sat above all of it. The timbered slopes kept the worst of the heat from the ranch buildings, and the spring that fed down from the upper pasture ran cold even in August, and the horses in the north pasture stood in the long grass and lifted their heads sometimes to catch the wind that came down off the peaks, a wind that smelled of pine resin and cold granite and distance. Colt Reardon had lived on Black Spur Ridge for 7 years. Before that, he had lived there with his wife. After she died, he had stayed because there was nowhere else he particularly wanted to be, and because the work required him whether he wanted it to or not, and because on certain mornings in certain lights the place looked exactly like it had looked when Nora was alive, and he was not sure if that was a reason to stay or a reason to leave, but he had never resolved the question, and so he had simply remained. He was not known in Harrow Creek as a friendly man. He was known as a competent one. He paid his debts on time. He kept his fences. He ran good cattle on difficult land and managed it better than most men would have. He came down to town 4 or 5 times a year, bought what he needed, said less than 10 words to anyone who wasn't selling him something, and went back up. The town had theories about him, the way small towns develop theories about people who decline to explain themselves. They called him the Ghost of Black Spur, which was not a name he had chosen but which had stuck because it was not entirely wrong. Nora had been dead for 7 years. She had died on a high pass in early November because Colt had chosen a faster route, coming back from Laramie, and the weather had changed faster than he had expected, and by the time he understood the situation it was too late to change it. He had been making that calculation over and over for 7 years. He had never arrived at a different answer. He had simply learned to carry the weight of it without letting it show, which was not the same thing as putting it down. Wren Calloway had been washing other people's laundry in Harrow Creek for 2 years when Garrett Reardon came to her door. She was 19 years old. She had brown hair and gray-green eyes and hands roughened from work and a spine that did not bend regardless of what was pressing on it. Her father, Thomas Calloway, had died 14 months earlier, owing $340 to Garrett Reardon, who was the largest landowner between Harrow Creek and the Wyoming border, and a man who believed that debts should be paid and that sentiment had no place in business. Garrett was not a cruel man. He was a man who had decided long ago that the world ran on contracts and consequences, and he had organized his life around this conviction with considerable success. He came to Wren's door on a Tuesday morning in late May with his hat in his hand and 3 weeks of a solution already prepared. Wren Calloway could work off the debt in 7 years of domestic service on the Reardon property, starting immediately, or she could marry Garrett's nephew, Colt Reardon, settle the debt in a single stroke, and be done with it. He needs a wife, Garrett had said, standing on her small porch with no apology in his voice. He lives up in the mountains, mostly keeps to himself. You'd have a roof and a name and food on the table. There are worse arrangements, Miss Calloway. Wren had looked at the document with her father's signature on it, his careful, hopeful handwriting, the handwriting of a man who had always believed the next season would be better. She had felt something in her chest go very quiet and very cold. When, she had said. 3 weeks, said Garrett. And that had been that. She had not met Colt Reardon before the morning of the wedding. This was the detail that stayed with her in the weeks between Garrett's visit and the ceremony. Not the debt, not the arrangement, not even the strangeness of it, but the specific fact that she was going to marry a man she had never seen. She had heard things about him. Della Marsh, who ran the boarding house on the south end of Harrow Creek's Main Street and knew everything that happened within 30 miles in any direction, had told her over a basin of laundry that Colt Reardon had lived alone on Black Spur Ridge since his wife died 7 years ago. That he came down to town 4 or 5 times a year and said less than 10 words to anyone. That he was not mean, Della had said, wringing out a shirt with her capable hands. But he was not warm either. He's like the mountains up there. Just endures. Just stands. You can't talk to a mountain, honey. Wren had said nothing. She had kept wringing laundry. What was there to say? On the morning of the wedding, she put on a dress that had belonged to Della's younger sister, cream-colored and years out of fashion, let out at the waist and taken up at the hem with buttons that did not quite match. Della had pressed it herself and told Wren she looked lovely. Wren had stood in front of the small mirror above Della's washstand and looked at herself and thought, this is not how I imagined this day. She had not imagined the day much. Dreams of that nature had always seemed to her like something other girls were allowed to have. Girls with fathers who were still alive. Girls with money, girls who had options. Wren had spent most of her life being practical, but standing in that borrowed dress with pins still holding the bodice together at the back, she allowed herself just for a moment to feel the full weight of what was happening. She breathed in through her nose. She breathed out through her mouth. She picked up the small bunch of wildflowers Della had cut from her own yard that morning and tied with a bit of cotton twine. Then she walked to the church. The church was full, which surprised her. She had expected maybe a dozen people. Instead, the pews were packed, every face in town turned toward her as she came through the door. The heat inside was extraordinary. All those bodies in that small space, the air smelling of talcum powder and wood polish, and underneath both of those, the sharp salt smell of sweat. She walked down the aisle alone. There was no one to give her away. She had thought about this and decided it did not matter. She was not being given. She was paying a debt. Those were different things. She held her wildflowers in both hands and she looked straight ahead and she did not let her eyes fill. Colt Reardon was standing at the front of the church. She saw him for the first time from 20 feet away and then 15 and then 10 and then she was standing beside him. He was tall, broad through the chest and shoulders in the way of a man built by real work rather than intention, years of hauling and lifting and sleeping on cold ground. His hair was dark brown and cut without much attention to fashion. His jaw was angular and rough with a close-cut beard. He wore a dark coat that fit him imperfectly across the shoulders, just slightly too small, and he had the look of a man who owned one coat and wore it on the occasions that required it. He turned to look at her when she reached the altar. His eyes were brown, very dark, and they held for a fraction of a second an expression she could not read. Not cruelty, not an anticipation, something more complicated than either. Then he turned back to face the preacher, and the expression was gone. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Wren knew because she counted, the way she had counted steps in the dark as a child. Just get to the next number. The next number is something you can manage. She repeated her vows in a clear, steady voice because she refused to give the packed pews behind her the pleasure of hearing her falter. She did not look at Colt's face when she said the words. She looked at the preacher's collar button, which was coming loose on one side. When it was done, Colt turned to her. The preacher said something about the groom kissing the bride. Colt looked at her face, at the set of her jaw, at the particular steadiness in her eyes that suggested she had braced herself for this and intended to endure it with dignity. He thought about what it would mean to kiss a woman he did not know in front of 60 people who had come to watch a debt get settled. He nodded once deliberately, the nod of a man closing an agreement. He offered her his arm. He did not kiss her. From somewhere in the pews a person laughed. He did not turn to find out who. Wren took his arm. They walked back down the aisle together. Outside the light was very bright and very flat, and the heat was already settled and serious. And Colt helped her up onto the wagon seat and went around to the other side and picked up the reins, and they drove out of Harrow Creek in silence. There was a brief reception in the yard behind the church, Gerald Holtz doing cold chicken and summer bread and 2 pitchers of switchel. Wren stood with a glass of water in her hand and watched Colt move through the small crowd. The crowd did what crowds do around men they are slightly afraid of. They gave him room. He didn't speak much. He shook Garrett's hand. He accepted a piece of bread that someone pressed on him. He answered questions in as few words as he could manage and moved on before the conversation could develop into anything. He did not come to where she was standing. She told herself this was fine. She told herself she had not expected anything different. A woman appeared at her elbow. Her name was Dorothea Vance, the wife of the man who ran the land registry office, a woman Wren had known in the peripheral way you know people in a small town, by sight and reputation rather than any genuine acquaintance. "Well," said Dorothea, "I suppose this is the best a girl in your situation could hope for." Wren looked at her. "A roof," Dorothea continued pleasantly. "Food, a name. Most girls in your position end up worse off than this." She tilted her head slightly. "He's odd, of course. Everyone knows that. But odd is better than cruel. You'll have to manage him, is the thing. Men like that need managing. Keep the house clean. Don't ask too many questions. Stay out of his way." Wren took a slow sip of her water. "Thank you," she said in a tone that conveyed no gratitude whatsoever. Dorothea opened her mouth to say something else. She didn't get the chance because at that moment Colt appeared out of the crowd at Wren's left side, holding his hat and said, "The wagon's ready." He wasn't looking at Dorothea. He was looking at Wren, and there was something in his expression, just a flicker quickly controlled, that made Wren wonder if he had been standing close enough to hear. "All right," she said. She set down her water glass. She picked up the small bundle she had brought, everything she owned that was worth keeping, wrapped in cloth and tied with rope. She did not say goodbye to Dorothea Vance. She followed her husband through the crowd and out to the road where a solid bay horse was hitched to a flatbed wagon. He helped her up onto the seat. His hand was very large and very rough, and he let go the instant she was settled, stepped back and went around to the other side. They drove out of Harrow Creek in silence. The drive up the mountain took close to 4 hours. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. The road climbed through scrubland and then through aspen groves that shivered in the altitude wind, their leaves catching the light in the particular way that made them look like they were signaling something to someone who knew how to read it. The bay horse, a big steady animal colt called Drum, moved at a reliable walk that covered the miles without drama. Wren sat with her hands in her lap and watched the land change as they climbed. She had lived her whole life in Harrow Creek's flat valley. She had never been up into the mountains. It was stranger than she had imagined. Bigger. Quieter, more itself. The trees up here were serious trees. The rocks were serious rocks. Nothing up here was decorative. Everything existed because it had earned the right to exist in that particular spot through some long negotiation with weather and altitude and time. She found unexpectedly that she did not hate it. He said finally, "You don't have to be afraid of me." She turned and looked at him. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. He said, "Most people are. I'm used to it." "I'm not most people," she said. He glanced at her, then briefly, just a turn of his head, and she could not tell if the thing in his expression was skepticism or something else. Then he turned back to the road. "No," he said after a moment. "Reckon you're not." He did not say anything else for another 2 hours, neither did she. The silence was not comfortable exactly, but it was not the silence of two strangers who had nothing to say to each other. It was something slightly less empty than that, a silence with the suggestion of shape. Black Spur Ridge rose on 3 sides as they came through the last section of the road, and the ranch came into view in the long evening light, low log buildings, a barn that was worn but solid, a kitchen garden with straight rows, and beyond the barn a pasture where horses stood with their heads down and their tails moving slow. The air was 20 degrees cooler than the valley and smelled of pine and horse and something green that had no name. A large gray dog appeared from around the side of the barn and stopped and regarded Wren with calm yellow eyes. "That's Flint," Colt said. "He'll leave you alone if you want him to." Wren looked at the dog. The dog looked at her. His tail moved once, slowly, with the careful quality of a creature reserving judgment but keeping options open. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. She stood in the yard for a moment and looked at the mountains and breathed the cool air. Then she picked up her bundle and followed Colt inside. The house was clean in the particular way of a space that has been cleaned recently and self-consciously, not the deep clean of domestic habit, but the clean of a man who has thought about what a room might look like to someone seeing it for the first time and has acted on that thought. The floor was swept. The table had been wiped down. There were no dirty dishes in the basin. He set her bundle on the table. He walked to the short hallway and indicated the door on the left. "That's your room," he said. She looked at the door, then she looked at him. "Mine's at the end," he said. He said it without elaboration, then added, "There's a bolt on your door." On the inside, she was very still. He said it the way he said things that were plainly true, with no performance in it, no implication that he expected gratitude or acknowledgement. He was telling her how the house was arranged. This was a feature of the house. "All right," she said when she had found her voice again. "Kitchen has most of what you need." He moved back toward the main room. "I'll show you in the morning. There's cold venison and bread on the bottom shelf." He picked up his hat from the table. "You haven't eaten since this morning." It was not a question. She had not eaten at the reception. The reception food had been impossible to touch under the eyes of 60 people who had come to watch a debt get settled. He went outside to put the horse up. Wren stood alone in the main room and listened to his boots cross the porch and Flint's paws behind them. She walked to the door on the left. She opened it. The room was small. A bed with a plain cotton quilt, a wooden chest, a window with a white curtain. And on top of the chest, a blue crockery jug with a handful of wildflowers, purple and yellow, picked that morning because they were still fresh. She stood in the doorway and looked at the flowers for a long time. She thought about a man who had driven down the mountain for a wedding he had not wanted, and driven back up for a marriage he had not asked for, and had found time somewhere in between to pick wildflowers and put them in a blue jug in a room with a bolt on the inside of the door. She thought, I don't know what kind of man you are. She thought, I am going to have to find out. She found the venison and the bread where he had said they would be. She ate standing at the kitchen shelf, looking out the small window at the darkening shapes of the mountains. The food was plain and she was hungry, and it was without question the best thing she had eaten in weeks. She changed out of the borrowed dress carefully, folding it in case it needed to be returned in reasonable condition, and put on her own cotton nightgown. She went to the room with the bolt. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened. Through the wall, eventually, the sounds of a man at the end of a long day. Boots set aside, a chair, water from the pump, quiet. She lay down, she reached over and slid the bolt into place. Then she lay back and looked at the ceiling and thought about purple and yellow flowers in a blue crockery jug, and about 11 minutes of vows counted like steps in the dark, and about the fact that she was now, legally and completely, Mrs. Wren Reardon, a name she was not ready for yet and might not be ready for some time. She thought, I don't know what happens next, she thought, but I am still here, I am still me, that is not nothing. Outside, the mountains sat in the dark as they always had, enduring, as if endurance were simply what mountains did and they had never considered an alternative. She slept. She woke before dawn, not from any sound or disturbance, but from the particular alertness of a body that has spent years sleeping light in uncertain circumstances. She lay still for a moment and remembered where she was and why. It came back in a single quiet wave, and she sat up and dressed in the dark, her own clothes, not borrowed anything, her own boots, her hair pinned without a mirror as she had been doing without a mirror for years. She unbolted the door. The main room was gray and still. She found the wood stove by feel, found the kindling beside it, and had a fire going in less time than it would have taken most women to locate the matches. She had been lighting fires since she was 8 years old. She filled the kettle from the pump out back, the cold of the handle a shock in the early air, and set it on the stove, and she stood in the warming kitchen and thought, this is the first morning. Start as you mean to go on. She had the coffee measured and salt pork frying and cornbread starting in the pan by the time she heard Boots in the hallway. Colt Reardon stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. She looked back at him. He was already dressed, which meant he had been awake before her or had not slept at all, and his face in the early light was the same careful arrangement of planes and angles it had been at the altar, unreadable but not unkind. He looked at the stove. He looked at the pan. He looked at the coffee. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know, she said. Sit down. Something moved through his expression. He sat down. She put coffee in front of him and then the salt pork and cornbread, and she sat across from him with her own plate, and they ate without speaking. The fire in the stove made the only sound. It's good, he said finally. He said it quietly, the way a man speaks who does not say such things often and is slightly uncomfortable saying them now. Thank you, said Wren. The silence resumed. But it was different from the silence of the wagon. Different from the silence that had held the first hour of the drive up the mountain. Not the silence of two strangers. Something slightly less empty. A silence with the faintest suggestion of shape. When he finished, he put his plate in the basin and picked up his hat. He stopped before he went out. The house is yours, he said. Do whatever you want with it. What needs doing today, she said. On the ranch. What needs doing? He turned and looked at her the way she would come to understand. He looked at weather systems moving in over the ridge, assessing, not alarmed, waiting for more information. The kitchen garden needs water, he said slowly. The mare in the third stall is due in the next week. She'll need checking. And the fence along the east pasture has a section that keeps coming loose. I was going to do the fence myself. I can water the garden and check the mare, she said. You know horses, he said. I know enough. He studied her for a moment longer. Then he put his hat on, touched the brim, that short automatic gesture she would come to know as well as her own heartbeat, and went out. Wren cleared the table. She felt something in her chest that was not happiness exactly, but was close enough to it to be worth noting. The particular sensation of standing on ground you expected to shift and finding that it holds. The mare's name was Bess, and she was enormous and brown, and she had the expression of a horse who had been through this before and found the whole process undignified. Wren spent an hour with her that first morning, talking low and moving slow, learning what Bess would tolerate and what she would not. Bess had clear opinions on both subjects and communicated them without ambiguity. Wren respected this and adjusted accordingly. By the time she left the stall, Bess had permitted a thorough check, accepted dried apple from Wren's pocket, and given her one long measured look that communicated something like provisional acceptance, pending further evidence. Flint had followed her to the barn and sat outside the stall door the entire time with his great gray head on his paws. When Wren came out, he stood and looked at her. You're a very serious dog, she said. He blinked. All right, she said. We understand each other. She found the loose section of east fence by following the line, until she found the place where it was obviously failing, which was not difficult because it was failing with considerable commitment. She could not fix it without tools and did not know where the tools were, but she examined it carefully and knew what it needed, and she walked back to find Colt. He was in the far end of the barn working on a piece of tack. He looked up when she came in. "East fence," she said. "Third post from the big boulder is rotted at the base. The wire is pulling loose from it. You need a new post, not just the wire restrung." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know that?" "Because I looked at it," she said. "My father had a fence like that once. He restrung the wire twice before he accepted that the post was the problem. It cost him 2 seasons. Something shifted in Colt's face, barely visible, a slight recalibration. "I'll get a post cut," he said. "I can help set it," Wren said, "if you show me how." He looked at her for what felt like a long time. "After the noon meal," he said. She nodded and went back to the house. She did not allow herself to feel pleased about this. She told herself it was a practical arrangement between 2 people sharing a working property. Practicality, that was all. But she found herself back in the kitchen, almost smiling, and she pressed her lips together and concentrated on the beans she was sorting. She found the grave on the 3rd day. She had not been looking for it. She was walking the property line to learn it, mapping it in her mind the way she had always mapped places she needed to understand. And she came out of the timber above the house into a small flat clearing with a view down across the entire valley, and she saw the wooden marker. It was not elaborate. A plank of wood, sanded smooth, with letters carved into it with careful, unpracticed effort. Not the work of a man who carved often, but the work of a man who had wanted to do it correctly regardless. Nora Eleanor Reardon. Beloved. 1871. Wren stood very still. She did the arithmetic without meaning to. 1871 was 7 years ago. The ranch, from what she had seen of it, bore the marks of a man who had lived in it alone for roughly that length of time. Not neglected, not falling apart, but maintained quietly, steadily by a single pair of hands with no particular reason to make it more than functional. She looked at the view. The whole wide valley going golden in the afternoon light, mountains holding the world together at its edges. She thought about a man who had chosen this particular spot for exactly this particular reason, and who came up here sometimes, probably, and stood where she was standing now. She left without touching anything and did not mention it. But that evening, when Colt came in for supper and sat down at the table and put his hat in its place, she found that something in the way she looked at him had shifted. Not pity. She did not think he would want pity. Something else. A shape to the silence she had not been able to name before and could still not name precisely, but could at least now locate. On the morning of the 14th day, she found the contract. She had not been looking for it either. She had been going through the small wooden crate she kept her personal things in, the letters from her father written before the debts got bad, photograph of her mother, a piece of ribbon she had kept since childhood for no reason she could name. At the bottom of the crate, folded very small, was the document Garrett Reardon had given her with the terms of the arrangement. She had kept it because she thought she might need to refer to it, though she had not read it through more than once. She unfolded it and read it again at the kitchen table in the morning light. The language was what she expected. Debt settlement, transfer of obligation, the name Thomas Calloway, the sum of $340. But at the bottom of the document, below Garrett's signature, was a clause she had not examined carefully before. In the event that the union proves untenable to either party within the first year of the arrangement, Mr. Reardon retains the right to dissolve the agreement and return Miss Calloway to Harrow Creek, at which point the original debt shall be considered reinstated in full. She sat with this for a long time. He retained the right. That was the language. Colt could end this if he chose, send her back, and the debt would be hers again, $340, with no father left to be responsible for it, no way to pay it, no recourse of any kind. She was not functionally any more secure than she had been in Harrow Creek. She was only differently situated. She folded the letter and put it back in the crate. She stood up. She went to start the noon meal, because this was what you did. You stood up and you got on with it. But something had shifted. A new awareness had arrived. The ground, which had been feeling more solid, had revealed that its solidity was conditional. The mornings and the coffee and the east fence and Bess in the third stall and the way Colt touched the brim of his hat before he went out. None of it was guaranteed. None of it was hers in any permanent sense. She put the beans on and did not say anything. That afternoon, Colt found her at the kitchen table mending a tear in one of his shirts. She had taken it without asking because it needed doing. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke. "Something wrong," he said. She looked up. "No." He came in and poured himself a cup of cold coffee and leaned against the counter and watched her the way he watched things he was not sure about yet. She had learned in 2 weeks that he watched carefully, that he noticed details most people overlooked. "Different kind of quiet today," he said. She set the shirt down. She thought about saying it was nothing. She had been good at that particular deflection her entire life and had no reason to doubt she could deploy it now. She thought about it seriously. Then she thought about the clause in the contract and about what it would mean to carry it alone. "I read the contract again," she said. "The full terms. I understand what you retain the right to do. I'm not asking you about it. I just wanted you to know that I know." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Colt set his coffee cup down on the counter. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. When he looked up, his expression had changed in a way she had not seen before. Not the brief crack of something unexpected, but something more deliberate, more effortful. The expression of a man opening a door he has kept shut for a very long time and is not entirely sure the hinges will hold. "I didn't write that clause," he said. His voice was level. "I know Garrett did. I didn't ask for it." He said it without performance, without emphasis, as a plain fact. "I told him I didn't want it." Wren said nothing. She was listening to everything, the words and the spaces between them. "I'm not going to use it," he said. He said it the way he said things that were settled, the certainty of a man making a statement of fact and not an argument. "That's not what this is." "What is it?" she said. The question sat between them in the kitchen. He picked up his coffee cup again. He looked at the window above the basin, at the light coming through it, at the mountains beyond. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. "I don't know yet," he said finally, "but it's not that." Wren looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the shirt and the needle and found her place in the seam. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated. "I believe you," she said, simply, and returned to her sewing. She did not see his face in that moment, but she heard after a while the quiet sound of him pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down. And when she glanced up, he was there, coffee in hand, eyes on the middle distance, and he did not leave for a very long time. The days established themselves into a rhythm, the way water establishes channels, finding the path of least resistance and deepening it until the path is simply the way things go. Wren learned the ranch the way she had learned every place she had needed to understand, by paying attention to what it required rather than what she wanted from it. She learned which horses needed a soft approach and which needed a firm one. She learned that the pump out back ran slow on cold mornings and needed coaxing. She learned that Flint would not eat if his bull was placed too near the water trough. She also learned colt, not quickly and not completely, but in the incremental way you learn a landscape by walking it repeatedly in different light. She learned that his silences were not hostile, that they were simply how he processed, the way some men talk their way through problems, and Colt thought his way through them instead, quietly and thoroughly. She learned that he noticed things, small things, the way a post was angled, the way a horse held its weight, the way a fence line moved slightly off true over a long stretch of ground. He did not remark on these things. He simply corrected them, and if you were paying attention, which Wren was, you understood from this that he held the world to a high standard of precision and was quietly, persistently working to meet it. She learned that he was not without humor. It was infrequent and delivered without expression, but it was there. He had said something on the fourth day about Flint's tracking of her movements through the property that was, she realized a moment after he said it, a joke. She had looked at him and he had already looked away, but there had been something at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same general territory. She stored this information carefully. She was learning him. She was not sure what she intended to do with what she learned. She told herself this was practical. Two people sharing a working property needed to understand each other. That was efficiency, not anything more complicated. But on the 15th day, she caught herself, in the middle of splitting kindling behind the barn, thinking about the blue jug and the wildflowers, and she set the axe down and looked at the mountains for a moment before she picked it up again. Colt started teaching Wren to ride properly on a Tuesday morning in the third week, in the small paddock behind the barn. The horse he chose for this was Opal, a gray mare of middle age, with the temperament of a schoolteacher who has seen everything and is no longer surprised by any of it. Opal was patient in the way that only very intelligent animals are patient, not passively, not from absence of opinion, but from a considered decision that cooperation was generally more efficient than resistance. Wren had ridden before. She had ridden her father's old plow horse bareback through 2 summers when she was young, which was not the same thing as riding properly, and she knew it. What Colt was teaching her was different. It was about weight rather than grip, about settling into the saddle rather than bracing against it, about communicating something to the horse through the quality of your stillness rather than through pressure or command. He explained this standing at the fence rail with his arms resting on the top board, watching her circle the paddock at a walk. He did not explain it all at once. He said one thing, waited for her to work with it, then said the next thing. This was, she noticed, how he did everything. One task at a time, completed before the next one began. "Stop gripping with your knees," he said. "You're telling her you're afraid of falling." "I'm not afraid of falling," Wren said. "Your knees are." She thought about this and adjusted. Opal's stride changed almost immediately, became smoother, more willing. "There," Colt said. She made 3 more circuits of the paddock. The morning was cool and the light was low and gold across the grass, and somewhere above the tree line a hawk was working the thermals in long, patient circles. Wren paid attention to her weight, to the way Opal moved underneath her, to the thing Colt had described as settling, like you're telling the horse you're not going anywhere and neither is she. She was beginning to feel it, the thing he meant. A quality of stillness that was not rigid but relaxed, weight dropping rather than clutching, the difference between holding on and belonging there. Then a rabbit burst out of the grass at the paddock's edge. Opal shied sideways, one sharp movement, and Wren, who had been settling so beautifully, forgot entirely about settling and grabbed the saddle horn and overcorrected and came off the left side with a completeness that left no room for interpretation. She hit the dirt of the paddock and lay there for a moment looking up at the sky, which was very blue and very indifferent, and felt the full indignity of her situation with perfect clarity. She heard it. From the fence post where Colt was standing, a sound escaped. Short, low, involuntary. The sound of a man whose self-control has been overridden briefly and completely by something he did not expect to find funny and found funny anyway. She turned her head and looked at him. He had both hands on the top fence rail, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Open, unguarded, a brightness in his eyes that changed him so entirely that for a moment she did not quite recognize him. It was not a cruel expression. It was the expression of a man genuinely surprised by his own amusement and not yet recovered from it. "If you laugh at me," she said from the dirt, "I will put salt in your coffee for a month." The laugh came again, fuller this time, and he pressed his mouth together and looked away at the mountains and then looked back, and the corners of his eyes were creased and he was working very hard to be serious and failing completely. She sat up and pulled a piece of dried grass from her hair. She looked at Opal, who had stopped 3 feet away and was regarding her with an expression of gentle concern. "Traitor," she told the horse. Opal blinked. Colt had come around the fence by then, and he offered his hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet, and for a moment they were very close, her hand in his, both of them in the dust and the morning light, and the brightness in his eyes was still there up close. She realized she had not known his eyes could look like that. She realized she was looking at the actual man, the one that existed underneath the 7 years of managed distance, and that he was someone she had not quite been prepared for. She stepped back and brushed off her skirt. "Again," she said. Something in his face went soft in a way she had no word for yet. Again he agreed. She remounted. They worked for another hour. She did not fall off again, which she considered a personal victory of the highest order. When they finished and she was walking Opal back to the barn, she was aware of something that had shifted in the air between them, something that had not been there that morning and was there now, not large, not declared, but present. She did not name it. She was not ready to name it. She was becoming aware that she would need to be, eventually. The water problem arrived without warning the way the worst problems always did, not as a single event, but as an accumulation of small signs that only made sense when you looked at them together. Colt noticed it first. He noticed everything first on this ranch. The upper spring was running lower than it should have been for the season, lower than he remembered it running in a dry summer, lower than the rainfall alone could explain. He rode the spring line twice in the same week and came back both times with a jaw set tighter than usual. He told Wren about it over supper on a Thursday evening, plainly, without elaboration, the way he told her everything that mattered. The upper spring that fed the north pasture trough was running at less than a quarter of its normal output. The lower creek that watered the kitchen garden and the near barn was following the same direction. If the summer held as dry as it had been, by August they would be hauling water by barrel from the river 4 miles down the mountain, and the time and labor cost of that would affect everything else on the ranch. And there was more. There was a man, Colt said, named Boyd Garnett. He owned the property that bordered Black Spur Ridge on the north, where the boundary ran directly through the area where the upper spring originated. About 3 years ago, Garnett had begun diverting water. Not much. Enough that Colt had noticed, but not enough to take to a county judge, because judges in this county tended to see what Garnett wanted them to see. Garnett had money. In this county, that was most of the argument. 3 years, Wren said. 3 years, Colt confirmed. He's been building his lower pasture, expanding. He doesn't need more water than he has naturally. He's taking it because he can take it. Wren thought about this in the way she thought about problems, turning it over, looking at it from the edges rather than the center. "Is there another source on your property?" she asked. "There's a wet area in the upper timber I've always thought was a seep. I never developed it because the spring was enough." He was quiet for a moment. "I kept putting it off because it's a significant job and the spring was sufficient. Until now." "Until now," Wren agreed. She sat with it. He sat with it. This was something she had come to understand about the two of them, that they could hold a problem in shared silence without either of them feeling the need to fill that silence with noise. It was one of the more useful things they had discovered about each other. "We dig the seep," she said finally. "It's weeks of work. So it's weeks of work." "Wren," he said, and then stopped. He almost never used her name. The sound of it in his voice did something to the inside of her chest that she catalogued carefully and set aside for later consideration. "You didn't sign on for this. I signed on for this ranch," she said. "Whatever that means." She looked at him steadily across the table. "Tell me what we need to get started." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression, the one she was learning to read, the one that had started as assessment and had been quietly becoming something else in increments, too small to point to individually but undeniable in accumulation. "I need to go to Harrow Creek," he said. "Talk to a man about pipe fittings. Day after tomorrow." "I'll come with you," she said. He did not say no. She took that for what it was. They went down the mountain on a Wednesday morning, Drum pulling the flatbed with both of them on the seat. The valley was already hot by mid-morning, the heat rising off the pale ground in visible waves, and Harrow Creek materialized out of the scrubland exactly as it always had, small and certain of its own importance. They went to the hardware first. Colt spoke with the man behind the counter about pipe specifications and fittings, and Wren listened carefully because this was information she was going to need to be useful in the coming weeks. She noted the dimensions, the types of pipe, the method of connection. She asked 2 questions. The hardware man looked at her with brief surprise and then answered them, which she appreciated. They separated after. She went to the dry goods store for salt and thread and several items the kitchen was running short on. She paid from the household fund Colt had established without comment in the second week, which she had been managing with the precision of someone who understood exactly what money meant when there was not enough of it. She was coming out of the dry goods store when she nearly walked into Dorothea Vance. Dorothea stopped dead on the wooden walkway and looked at her. Wren stopped too. "Well," said Dorothea. "Wren Calloway. Still up there on that mountain." "Wren Reardon," Wren said pleasantly. Dorothea's smile did not change, but something behind her eyes recalculated. "Of course. Forgive me." She looked Wren over carefully, taking inventory of the clean dress and the straight posture and the absence of anything that might be interpreted as suffering. "And how are you finding it? All alone with him up there?" "We manage," Wren said. "He must be." Dorothea paused, selecting. "Difficult to live with. A man like that." "A man like what?" "Well, odd, closed off. You know what people say about him." "I know what people say," Wren agreed. "People say a great many things. They're frequently wrong." She stepped around Dorothea and was walking toward the wagon when she heard the voice behind her, pitched louder now, with the particular quality of a performance addressed to the 3 women standing outside the millinery who had been watching the exchange with focused attention. "I'm sure it's tolerable," Dorothea said. "I suppose a girl in her situation has to make the best of things. Married off like that. You do what you have to do." Wren stopped. She turned around slowly. The 3 women outside the millinery were watching. A man coming out of the saloon had paused. The street had done what small-town streets do when something is about to happen, drawn itself quiet, holding its breath. She felt the familiar weight of it, the debt and the marriage and the girl in her situation. A whole life reduced to a transaction in the eyes of people who had never considered what it might cost. She looked at Dorothea Vance and opened her mouth. And then she heard boots on the wooden walkway behind her, and Colt Reardon walked past her and stopped between her and Dorothea, and when he spoke his voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the kind of voice that required everyone within range to go quiet in order to hear it, and everyone within range did. "Mrs. Vance," he said. Dorothea's smile flickered. "My wife," Colt said, "came down this mountain today because this is her town as much as it is yours. She has as much right to this street as anyone standing on it." His voice stayed level, stayed quiet, stayed entirely and completely certain of itself. "The next time you'd like to say something about her, you'll say it to her face, or you won't say it. That's the only way this is going to work." Dorothea Vance stared at him. The 3 women outside the millinery stared at him. The man from the saloon stared at him. Colt touched the brim of his hat, turned and offered Wren his arm. She took it. They walked back to the wagon together and climbed up and drove out of Harrow Creek the way they had come in, and the town watched them go, and Wren sat with her hands in her lap and her spine very straight, and she did not say anything until they were a mile up the mountain road and the town was a pale smudge in the heat behind them. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I was going to handle it myself." "I know that too." He was watching the road, "But she stopped talking to you and started talking about you." He paused. "That's different." She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, his face its ordinary arrangement, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that she had learned to read. Not quite tension, but its resolution. A man who had done what he intended to do. "You didn't like it," she said. "Not a question." "No," he said. "The way they talked about it, the wedding, the arrangement." He was quiet for 2 bends in the road. "No," he said again, and this time the word held more weight, had more rooms in it. "I didn't like it then either, the way it was set up." He stopped, started again. "You didn't have a choice. That was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I agreed to it." Wren was very still. "You couldn't have known me," she said at last. "You didn't know what I needed." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." He looked at her then, briefly, pulling his eyes from the road for a moment. "But I know you now. Some. More than I did." He turned back. "And he paused for what felt like a long time. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" she asked. He thought about it. She could see him thinking about it, giving the question the same care he gave to everything that mattered. "Someone who would manage," he said finally. "Someone who'd get through it." He paused. "Not someone who'd fix things." Wren looked at the road ahead of them, at the mountain getting larger and greener as they climbed, at the sky going gold toward late afternoon. "Colt," she said, "yeah. Tell me about Nora." The silence that followed lasted through 2 bends in the road. She did not push it. She had learned not to push. "She was kind," he said at last. His voice had changed, become careful in the way of a man stepping onto ice he knows will hold but is testing anyway. "She was the kindest person I've known. Didn't have a sharp edge on her anywhere." Another pause. "She died because I made a decision about which road to take coming back from Laramie. Faster route. Went through the high pass. The weather changed. She thought it would be fine. It wasn't fine. Wren did not say she was sorry. She could tell he did not want that. "So you closed," she said instead. "After I closed," he agreed. And now she said, "I don't know what I am," he said, with the kind of rough honesty that she thought probably cost him something. "That's the truth of it. I don't know." She nodded. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the road. "All right," she said. "You keep saying that," he said, and there was something almost wondering in it. "Because it keeps being true," she said. The wagon rolled on up the mountain, and the mountains received them the way they always did, without fanfare, as if this were simply the order of things, two people returning to where they belonged. The seep took 11 days. 11 days of digging in the upper timber in the July heat, of hauling pipe fittings up the mountain on drums back, of working out by trial and error, and one significant argument about slope gradient, how to move water downhill in the precise direction they needed it to go. Wren worked beside Colt from first light until the heat became unreasonable, and then they came back in the afternoon when the shade moved. She learned things in those 11 days that she had not known she was capable of learning. How to read ground for moisture. How to set pipe fittings properly so they would not work loose in the first hard freeze. How to shore a channel wall so it would not collapse under the weight of spring runoff. She also learned how Colt worked. He was methodical. He did not rush and he did not cut corners. And when something did not work, he stopped and looked at it and thought about why before he tried it differently. He's explained things when she asked and did not explain things she had not asked about. He had a way of working alongside someone that made you feel capable rather than supervised, and she had worked for enough people in her life to understand that this was not nothing. On the 9th day, the water ran, not much, a thin clear thread of it down the channel they had built, moving cold and real over the packed earth, but it ran. Wren crouched at the edge of the channel and put her hand in it, and felt the cold against her palm. She sat back on her heels and felt something so purely good that she had no word for it. She looked up at Colt, who was standing over the channel watching the water move with an expression that was as close to relief as his face allowed. "It's running," she said. Unnecessary, but she said it anyway. "It's running," he had agreed. They looked at each other across the channel, with the cold water moving between them, and she thought, "We built this. Not he built it, not she helped." Both of them, two people who had been strangers 8 weeks ago, and the water was running because of both of them. She looked back at the water before her expression could say too much. The letter from Garrett Reardon arrived on a Tuesday, brought up by the boy who rode the mail route once a week from Harrow Creek. Wren recognized Garrett's handwriting on the envelope and brought it to Colt without opening it. He read it at the kitchen table after supper. He read it once, set it down, then read it again. His face had gone to its controlled blank, which she had learned was not blankness at all, but its opposite. A face working very hard to contain something. "What does it say?" she asked. He pushed it across the table to her. She read it. Garrett was writing to inform Colt, in what he described as a spirit of transparency, that a boundary survey recently completed on the northern border of Black Spur Ridge suggested that a strip of Reardon land along the northern pasture had been incorrectly recorded in the original deed. The survey had been commissioned by Boyd Garnett. Garnett intended to file a legal claim on the strip in question. The strip in question ran directly through the water channel they had just spent 11 days building. Wren read the letter a second time. She set it down. "He knew," she said. Colt's jaw was tight. "I don't know that." "You know that," she said, not unkindly. "Garrett has been doing business with Garnett for years. That's not a secret in Harrow Creek. He knew about this survey before he wrote to you. He sent this letter now because the channel is finished. The work is done. The water is running, and now Garnett is ready to claim it. That's not something I can prove." "No," she said. "But it's true." He got up from the table and stood at the kitchen window. He was very still in the way he became still when something was serious. Not the absence of movement, but its deliberate suspension. A man gathering himself. "The strip is 40 feet wide," he said. "It runs right through the channel. If Garnett gets the claim filed and it goes his way, he doesn't get just the land. He gets the water. How long does a filing take? Weeks. Maybe more, depending on the judge." He paused. "Depending on how much Garnett pays the judge." Wren was quiet. She thought about the water running cold and clear down the channel. She thought about Colt's face when it started running. She thought about what a summer without water meant for this place, for everything they had been building. "Who recorded the original deed?" she said. "Man named Thaddeus Pruitt. He's been the land registrar in this county for 40 years. Is he Garnett's man?" Colt turned from the window. He looked at her carefully. "Why? Because if he's not, he might have the original survey notes, the ones from before Garnett's survey. And if those two surveys disagree, that's a legal argument." Colt looked at her with the expression she had come to know, the one that happened when she said something that came out differently than he had expected. "Not surprise, exactly. Recalibration. Pruitt is not Garnett's man," he said slowly. "He's his own man, old and particular. He doesn't like Garnett. Garnett tried to renegotiate a service fee about 10 years ago, and Pruitt threw him out of the office. Then we need to talk to Pruitt," she said, "before Garnett does." He picked up his hat from the table. He looked at it. He put it back down. "I'll ride down tomorrow," he said. "We'll ride down tomorrow," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You keep doing that. You keep leaving openings," she said. And despite the letter and Garnett and all of it, something in his expression lifted briefly, and he almost smiled, and she filed that away with everything else she was collecting about him. They rode to Harrow Creek the next morning before the worst of the heat arrived. Pruitt's land office was on the far end of the main street. A narrow building that smelled of old paper, and the particular careful order of a man who had spent 40 years in close company with records and has developed opinions about their proper maintenance. Thaddeus Pruitt was 70 years old, small and possessed of an expression that suggested he had seen every variety of human dishonesty and had not been impressed by any of it. He looked at Colt when they came in, and he looked at Wren and he said, "Heard you got married, Reardon." "I did," said Colt. "This is her," Pruitt said. "This is Wren," said Colt, which was not precisely an answer to Pruitt's question, but Wren appreciated it anyway. Pruitt looked at her with sharp gray eyes. "You're the one who's got him coming down the mountain more than once a season." "I am," said Wren. Pruitt made a sound that might have been approval. He gestured at the two chairs in front of his desk. "Garnett's letter," he said before either of them spoke. "I know why you're here. He sent me one too." He folded his hands on the desk. "Smug piece of work, that letter. Congratulating me on the survey results as if I had anything to do with them." Colt sat forward. "You know it's bought. I know Garnett hired a man from outside the county who arrived with the measurements already written in his notebook," Pruitt said. "I've been recording land in this county for 40 years. I know what a survey looks like when the numbers were decided before the measuring was done." He opened his desk drawer and produced a document. "I also kept the original survey of the Black Spur North boundary from 1861, he said. "Your father's deed." He put it on the desk. "The boundary in my records puts that northern line 14 feet further north than Garnett's survey claims, which means the strip he's claiming doesn't exist." He tapped the document. "This is the legal record. His survey is theater. Can you hold it?" Colt said. "If he files a claim." "He hasn't filed yet," Pruitt said. "He's posturing. He does this. Makes noise, gets people to settle before it reaches a judge because most people don't want the trouble and the cost." He looked at Colt steadily. "You're not most people. You never settled before." "I had less to lose before," Colt said, and something in his voice when he said it made Wren look at him, and he was looking at the document on the desk and not at her. But she had the sudden clear impression that the thing he meant was not only the water channel. "If he files," Pruitt said, "I'll testify. My record's against his bought survey. I've done it before." He looked at both of them. "I don't like Garnett. He's the kind of man who believes this valley exists for his convenience. I've watched him take things from people for 20 years and waited for someone with enough to fight back." He paused. "You've got something worth fighting for now. Don't make me wait another 20 years. Wren looked at Colt. Colt looked at Pruitt. "We won't," Colt said. They rode back up the mountain in the afternoon with Pruitt's words, and the knowledge of the original survey sitting between them like something solid. The air cooled as they climbed, and the timber closed in on either side, and Flint, who had been left at the ranch, met them at the gate as if he had known exactly when they would return. That evening a letter arrived with the afternoon mail boy. Not from Garrett this time. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar to both of them, careful and deliberate, the writing of a man for whom writing did not come easily but who was making every effort. Colt opened it, he read it. He passed it to Wren. The letter was from a man named Virgil Greer. He ran a sheep operation on the western edge of the valley, bordering Garnett's property to the south. He had heard through Pruitt, apparently, that Colt Reardon was preparing to contest Garnett's boundary claim. He wanted Colt to know something. 12 years ago, Garnett had done exactly this to him. Same method. A survey commissioned by Garnett's man, a strip of land claimed, a legal threat filed. Virgil had settled because he could not afford the fight, and the settlement had included a non-disclosure agreement he was technically violating by writing this letter. He was willing to violate it. He was willing to testify if it came to that. At the bottom of the letter in the same careful hand, "I settled because I was alone. You've got more than I did. Use it." Wren read the letter twice. She folded it carefully and held it in her hands for a moment. She thought about a man who had been carrying this for 12 years and had kept the records and waited for someone to come and ask. She thought about what it meant that he was willing to break a legal agreement to write this letter. She thought about the phrase, "You've got more than I did," and she thought about what that more was, and she sat with the weight of it in the kitchen with the evening light coming through the window and Flint asleep by the stove. Colt was watching her. "We need to write to Pemberton," she said. "The lawyer in Laramie that Pruitt mentioned." Colt nodded slowly. "I was thinking the same thing." She set the letter on the table between them. "Virgil Greer will testify. Pruitt will testify. We have the original survey, and we have Garnett's own words, or we will if he comes up here and says them out loud, which I think he will." Colt looked at her. "Why?" "Because men like Garnett don't believe they need to be careful." She met his gaze. "He's taken from people for 20 years without consequence. He's going to come up here and tell us what he wants and expect us to accommodate him, because that's what has always happened before." Colt was quiet for a moment. "And when he does, I'll be listening," she said. "I'll write down exactly what he says within 2 hours of him leaving. Verbatim, date, time, witnesses present." He looked at her for a long moment across the kitchen table in the evening light, and the expression on his face was the open one, the one she had seen for the first time in the paddock when he laughed, and had been watching arrive more frequently since then, as if the door that had been shut for 7 years was being opened by degrees, each degree earned rather than given. You thought about this before today, he said. It was not a question. I thought about it the day we finished the channel, she said. When the water started running, she paused. I thought, someone is going to try to take this from us. I wanted to be ready. He said nothing for a moment. Then he reached across the table and picked up Virgil Greer's letter and read it again, slowly, the way he read everything that mattered. His son, Colt said quietly. What Garnett took from him. It wasn't just the land. No, Wren said. It was what the land could have become. Colt set the letter down. He looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked at her with the directness that was. She had come to understand his most honest expression, unmediated, without the management that usually sat between him and the world. Whatever comes next, he said, I want you to know that you are. He stopped. He started again. You're not what I expected. He had said this before, on the wagon road, but this time it meant something different, something more arrived at, more certain. I know, she said gently. He said, I mean that this is. He paused. He was not a man who found these words easily, and she watched him work for them and did not rush him. This is not what I expected my life to look like again. Having someone here. Wren looked at him. The fire in the stove made it sound. Outside the mountains were going dark. I know, she said again. And then, because it was true, and because he had said something true, and that was the arrangement between them now. So did I, eventually. He held her gaze. Something in him was very still in a different way than his usual stillness. Not the containment of something managed, but the quiet of something at rest. Boyd Garnett arrived the following Thursday with 3 men, and the confidence of someone who had not yet learned that the situation had changed. He rode into the yard of Black Spur Ridge on a Thursday morning in late August, with the unhurried pace of a man who has never had reason to hurry because things have always arranged themselves to his satisfaction before he arrived. He was a heavy man somewhere in his 50s, red-faced from the altitude, and from a general disposition toward being irritated by circumstances that did not comply with his expectations. He rode a good horse badly, the way men ride who own good horses but have never needed to be good riders themselves. Behind him came 3 men. One was his lawyer, a smooth individual from Laramie named Fitch who wore a town coat inappropriate for mountain weather and carried a leather case of the type associated with paperwork that cost people things. One was an official of the county court, present to serve documents. The third was a large, quiet man whose function was to stand slightly behind Garnett and to the right, which was the arrangement of men hired to make other men feel that compliance was the path of least resistance. Wren was in the kitchen garden when she heard them on the road. She straightened and shaded her eyes and watched them come through the gate and into the yard, and she put down her gardening tool and walked to the porch and stood on it. And Flint came from around the side of the barn and sat beside her, and she looked at the 4 riders and did not move. Colt was in the barn. She had seen him go in 20 minutes ago. She did not go to get him. Garnett pulled his horse up in the yard and looked at her. He looked around the yard for Colt, found no Colt, and looked back at her with the expression of a man mildly inconvenienced by the need to deal with a woman when he had come to deal with a man. Mrs. Reardon, he said. The use of her name was less a greeting than an assessment touching something to determine its weight. Mr. Garnett, she said. Your husband about. He'll be along shortly, she said. Which was true. Colt could not have gone far into the barn. Garnett shifted in his saddle. Fitch and the other 2 men sat their horses behind him and looked at various points in the middle distance. I've come to discuss a land matter, Garnett said. He said it with the formality of a man who has rehearsed the opening of this conversation. I'm aware of the land matter, Wren said. This seemed to mildly surprise him. He recalibrated visibly. Then you know I'm moving to file a claim on the north boundary strip. I know you intend to, she said. I also know what Thaddeus Pruitt's original survey says about that boundary, and I suspect you know as well, or you'd have filed already rather than riding up here first. Garnett looked at her for a moment with an expression working through several adjustments. He had come expecting to deliver terms to a man. He was being received by a woman who had clearly been thinking about this longer than he had anticipated. Pruitt's records are old, he said. Land records don't expire, Wren said. They're superseded by legitimate surveys conducted by licensed surveyors using methods that can be demonstrated and verified. She kept her voice pleasant and her eyes level. You're welcome to file. We'd welcome the opportunity to let a judge compare the documents. Garnett's face had taken on a particular shade that had less to do with the altitude than with a man not accustomed to having his openings closed before he could step through them. I'm prepared to offer a settlement, he said, a reasonable arrangement. Reardon acknowledges the north strip, which is correctly mine according to the survey, and I drop any further consideration of the water question. Wren felt these words land in her chest like stones dropped into still water. The water question. He was confirming it. Standing in Colt's yard with a court official present and a lawyer behind him, Boyd Garnett was confirming that he knew about the diversion, that he considered it a variable in a negotiation, that he had been taking water from this property for 3 years and viewed this fact as a bargaining position. She heard boots on the porch behind her. Colt came through the front door and stood beside her. He took in the yard in a single sweep. Garnett, the 3 men, the horses, the leather case, and then he looked at Garnett with an expression she recognized. The same expression he had worn on the mountain road when he told her about Nora. The same expression he wore when he was looking at something that required attention and had decided to give it his complete and undivided attention. "Garnet," he said. "Reardon," Garnet said. "I heard you," Colt said. He had come out the front door, which meant he had come through the house, which meant he had entered through the back while Garnet was talking. He had heard at least the last part of it. "The answer is no." Garnet's jaw set. "You want to take this to a judge?" "I've got a survey. You've got a performance," Colt said. His voice was quiet and entirely certain, and Garnet's large, quiet man shifted slightly in his saddle. "Pruitt's records go back to my father's deed. His documentation is clean and it's public record. You want to put that in front of any judge in Wyoming who isn't already paid for, you're welcome to try." He stepped off the porch into the yard. One step not threatening but not threatening either. He stopped and looked up at Garnet on his horse, and the geometry of mounted man and standing man did not operate the way it usually did. "And while we're having this conversation," Colt said, "how many years have you been running a diversion off the North Spring?" Garnet's face went through several colors. "Because that's documented too," Colt said. 3 years of records. Not a question, not a theory. Garnet looked at Wren. She did not know what he found in her expression, but she knew what she intended him to find. Steadiness. The particular quality of a person who has considered every version of this moment and has chosen which one to inhabit. "You want to settle this in court," Colt said. "We'll settle it in court. But right now you're on my land uninvited, and I'd like you to leave it." The silence in the yard had the texture of a moment balanced on its own edge. Garnet looked at Colt. He looked at Wren. He looked at Fitch, who gave him nothing, and at the large, quiet man, who also gave him nothing. "You're making a mistake," Garnet said. "Add it to my account," Colt said. Garnet gathered his reins. He turned his horse and rode out of the yard without another word, and his 3 men followed, and the sound of hooves on the mountain road faded and the yard went quiet. Wren let out a breath she had not been aware of holding. Colt turned and looked at her. "You talked to him," he said, "before I got out here. He arrived while you were in the barn. I wasn't going to stand on my own porch and say nothing. What did you say?" "I told him we had Pruitt's original survey and we'd welcome a judge comparing the documents." She paused. "I may have been slightly more confident about that than the situation strictly required." Something happened in his face. "Slightly," he repeated. "We do have Pruitt's record," she said. That part was accurate. He stood in the yard looking at her in the late morning light, and Flint sat between them with his great head moving back and forth between the two humans. And Colt shook his head once, not in negation but in the manner of a man absorbing something that continues to be slightly larger than he anticipated. "Come inside," he said. "We need to write to Pemberton today." She followed him, and as she passed him on the porch, she heard him say quietly, almost to himself, slightly more confident than the situation required. Not quite a laugh, but close enough. The letter went to Pemberton in Laramie that same afternoon. Pemberton replied within the week. He had reviewed the situation as Pruitt had described it and was willing to take the case. He had looked at the survey Garnet had filed with the Laramie court, because Garnet had in fact filed, moving faster than Pruitt had predicted, and Pemberton had found something. He wrote about it in the careful, measured language of a man who became animated about injustice and was trying to contain that animation within professional bounds, which Pruitt had warned them about. Pruitt had said Pemberton got angry when he thought something was genuinely unjust, and that this anger made him very effective in a courtroom, and that it was therefore a good sign. What Pemberton had found was this. The surveyor Garnet had hired had mislabeled a landmark. The large granite outcrop on the north boundary of Black Spur Ridge, the one that served as the primary reference point for all measurements in the original 1861 survey, had been identified in Garnet's survey as a different rock entirely. A smaller outcrop 200 yards to the west. This meant that every measurement Garnet's surveyor had taken began from the wrong point, which meant that every boundary line drawn from those measurements was wrong, which meant the claim had no valid foundation. Colt read this letter at the breakfast table and passed it to Wren. She read it and looked up. "Two measurements from different starting points will never agree," she said. "Basic geometry. The claim falls apart the moment anyone checks it against the actual terrain." He looked at her. Pemberton used almost exactly those words. She set the letter down. "Then we need Virgil Greer's testimony about what happened to him 12 years ago. And we need everything Pruitt has. And we need a court date." The hearing was set for the 22nd of October. In the weeks between Garnet's visit and the court date, the ranch continued its work, because work on a ranch does not pause for legal disputes. Bess foaled on a Tuesday night in the 3rd week of September, and Wren had been checking on her twice daily for the previous 10 days and had adjusted her sleep schedule accordingly, rising at midnight and at 3 for lamplit checks of the 3rd stall. Colt had told her she did not need to do this. She had told him that was not the current arrangement. He had not argued further. It was the 3 o'clock check that caught it. Wren knew immediately that something was wrong. Bess's distress was a different quality than ordinary late-stage labor, and when Wren checked she found the foal positioned incorrectly, and her hands were smaller than Colt's, and she understood both of these facts simultaneously. She went through the house without ceremony, knocked once on Colt's door and opened it. "Bess," she said, now. He was pulling his boots on before she finished the word. They worked in the lamplight of the third stall for the better part of an hour, Colt's hands and Wren's, talking each other through it in low, urgent voices, Bess exhausted and trusting them in the way animals trust people in extremity, completely and without reservation, because there is nowhere else to go. Wren spoke to Bess the entire time, her hand on the mare's neck, her voice low and steady, talking about nothing in particular, just sound, just presence, just the continuous reassurance that someone was there and was not going anywhere. The foal arrived at 10 minutes past 4 in the morning. A filly, dark brown, legs impossibly long, spectacular in the way that new things are spectacular before the world has had time to accustom itself to their existence. She folded onto the clean straw, and Bess turned and pressed her nose against her with a sound that was almost human in its exhausted relief. Wren sat back against the stall wall and found that her face was wet and was not entirely sure when this had happened. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. Colt was sitting against the opposite wall, and when she looked up he was looking at her, not at Bess and the foal, and his expression was the open one, the undefended one, fully present and not working to manage itself. "You talked to her the whole time," he said. His voice was low. "She needed to know someone was there," Wren said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "She did." Wren looked at the foal, at the way she was already working her legs, already attempting the ordinary task of learning to stand. "What will you call her?" she asked. "Figured you'd name her," Colt said, "since you've been up every night watching for her." Wren looked at the filly. She thought about new things and starting points and the particular quality of beginnings that arrive without announcement. "June," she said. "It's September," he said. "I know. But June is when things actually start. Not when the calendar says, when they actually start." He looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight. "June," he agreed. They rode to Harrow Creek the evening before the hearing and stayed at Della Marsh's boarding house, which Della had offered without being asked. Della was a woman of 60 who knew everything that happened within 40 miles in any direction and communicated most of it through implication rather than statement, which was more efficient and left her with more information than she gave away. She greeted Colt with the warmth she reserved for people she had decided to approve of, which she expressed by pressing a substantial cold supper on him and telling him he looked better than she had expected. "You look like a man with something to live for," Della told him with the bluntness that was her primary social mode. Colt glanced at Wren. "I am," he said. Della looked between them with the expression of a woman who has understood an entire situation from 2 words and is satisfied with the accuracy of her understanding. She excused herself to attend to something in the kitchen that almost certainly did not require her attention and left them to eat. Wren looked at her plate. She was aware that she was trying not to smile and not entirely succeeding. "She's not subtle," Colt said. "She never has been," Wren said. "It's one of her better qualities." He almost smiled. "Is it?" "She says what's true without making you work for it," Wren said. She picked up her fork. "I find that admirable." He was quiet for a moment. "She told you things." "About me. I wrote to her once a month," Wren said. "I wrote about the ranch and the horses in the water channel and Garnett." She paused. "She's intelligent. She assembled her own picture. And what picture did she assemble?" Wren looked at him steadily, apparently an accurate one. He held her gaze. Something in the way he was looking at her was soft and certain simultaneously, a combination she had not known a person's expression could hold until she had started learning to read his. They did not speak for a while after that, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that belongs to people who have earned it. Garrett Reardon was in the boarding house waiting room when they arrived after supper. He sat alone in a straight-backed chair with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who has understood something important too late and is not sure whether his presence will be welcomed or refused. He looked older than he had in June. Things had a way of aging a man when they went wrong. Colt looked at him for a long moment in the doorway. Then he said, "We'll talk tomorrow after." Garrett nodded. He put his hat back on. He left without speaking further. Wren said nothing until they were in the corridor. Then she said, "That was decent of you." "He raised me," Colt said simply, the way he always said it, not as an excuse. As a fact, he was still working out how to carry. The courtroom in Harrow Creek held 60 people, if they were willing to stand close together, and on the morning of the 22nd of October, every one of those spaces was filled. Wren had expected the immediate parties. She had not expected the room to look the way it looked when they walked in. Ranchers and townspeople and men she did not recognize who had ridden in from the outlying properties. All of them there for reasons of their own that had something to do with Boyd Garnett and 20 years of watching him take things from people who could not fight back. Virgil Greer was there. He sat in the second row with a wooden box on his knees and his hands resting on it, and his eyes sharp and patient. The eyes of a man who has been waiting a long time for a specific moment and has arrived at it and intends to be fully present for every second of it. Pemberton was already at the respondents' table, reviewing documents with the focused energy of a man who had been looking forward to this for 6 weeks. He was younger than Wren had imagined from Pruitt's description, sharp-featured, with ink stains on his right hand that suggested they were permanent. Garnett sat at the other table with Fitch beside him, and Fitch had the manner of a lawyer who has been winning these cases long enough to find them slightly routine. This manner, Wren thought, was going to be a problem for him today. Judge Adeline Voss came in and the room stood. She was perhaps 55, with gray at her temples and the bearing of a woman who had spent a long career making decisions in rooms full of people who had not expected to be taking direction from her and had learned to find this mildly tiresome rather than worth remarking upon. She looked at the packed gallery and said, "It appears Mr. Garnett has provided the county with a community gathering." She opened the case file. "Let us begin." Pemberton was better than Wren had allowed herself to hope. He was methodical and precise, and he had a gift for making the technical language of land law sound like common sense, which was the thing that mattered most in a room that was not full of lawyers. He laid out the two surveys side by side. He laid out Pruitt's records. He called Pruitt to the stand. Thaddeus Pruitt testified for 40 minutes with the authority of a man who has been right about things for 40 years and is accustomed to being able to demonstrate it. He explained the original 1861 survey in language that anyone could follow. He explained what Garnett's surveyor had done with the granite outcrop. He explained what this meant for every measurement taken from that point. Fitch objected several times. Judge Voss overruled most of them with a brevity that suggested she had read the documentation before arriving this morning. Then Pemberton called Wren. She had known this was coming. Pemberton had told them the night before that her account of what Garnett had said in the yard was the element that would make the case comprehensible to a room full of people who were not primarily interested in survey methodology. The technical case was solid. What the room needed was a human moment, a man standing in someone else's yard and stating plainly what he wanted and why. She walked to the stand. She was aware of the room. She was aware of Colt at the edge of the gallery, and Virgil Greer with his box, and Garnett at his table, and the 60 people who had come to see how this resolved. She was aware of all of it, and her hands were completely steady. Pemberton asked her to describe the morning when Garnett had come to the ranch. She described it. She described the 4 riders arriving in the yard. She described Garnett's manner and Fitch's manner, and the official with his papers. She described, in language she had written down within 2 hours of the event and had committed to memory since, the moment Garnett had answered her question about what he was actually after. He said, "She told the court, the water, the spring feeds my lower pasture. Your channel draws from the same source. I do not intend to share it." The room was quiet. "Those were his exact words," Pemberton said. "Those were his exact words," she said. "I wrote them down that afternoon within 2 hours of the conversation while the language was fresh. I provided the written account to counsel. There were 4 other people present in that yard when he said them. My husband, the lawyer Mr. Fitch, the court official serving the papers, and the 3rd man who rode with Mr. Garnett. Fitch's cross-examination was thorough and not unkind because Fitch was too experienced to be unkind in a room watching closely. It was designed to suggest that memory was imperfect, that words could be misremembered, that a woman who had come to this ranch under particular circumstances might have motivations that colored her recollection. "Mrs. Reardon," he said pleasantly, "you came to Black Spur Ridge under fairly unusual circumstances. Is that correct?" "I came as Colt Reardon's wife," she said. "Under a debt arrangement," he said. "Your father's debt." "My husband's debt is settled," she said. "The marriage is legal and documented." "Of course," he said. "But you'd agree that your personal and financial security are tied to the outcome of this case." Wren looked at him. She thought about the word security, about what it had meant in various seasons of her life. She thought about a girl washing other women's laundry in a town that thanked no one for anything. She thought about a contract with a clause at the bottom, and what she had understood sitting alone with it at the kitchen table. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "I came to this mountain with 1 dress and a bundle of personal effects and $340 of debt against my father's name. My security has never been tied to property or money. It is tied to my own 2 hands and my own word." She looked at him without any particular heat. "If you are suggesting that I would misrepresent what Boyd Garnett said in my yard in front of 4 witnesses, I would ask you to explain what version of my account could have served me better than the truth." The room stirred. Judge Voss made a note. Fitch moved on. Wren stepped down and walked back to the gallery and sat beside Colt. He did not say anything. His hand found hers under the edge of the table and held it, and she felt the steadiness of his grip, and she thought, yes, that is exactly right. That is what this is. Pemberton called Virgil Greer last. Virgil walked to the stand carrying his box with both hands, set it on the edge with care, and placed his palms flat on the lid. He was a man in his mid-60s with the hands of someone who had worked hard every day of his life, and the eyes of someone who had been waiting a long time for a specific kind of justice, and had not given up on its eventual arrival. He described what Garnett had done to his property 12 years ago. He described it the way he did everything, with dates and specifics and the careful accumulation of detail that came from a man who had written things down, because he had believed someone would eventually come and ask for them. He described the boundary dispute and the settlement, and the strip of land his son had planned to use for an orchard. Fitch cross-examined. "You're aware," he said, "that testifying here may violate the non-disclosure agreement you signed." "I'm aware," Virgil said. "And you're doing it anyway." "I am. Why?" Virgil looked at him. He looked at the room. He found Wren and Colt at the edge of the gallery and held their gaze for a moment. "Because my boy never got his orchard," he said. "And I would like to make sure someone else gets theirs." The room went still in the way rooms go still when something true and irreducible has been said in a space that needed to hear it. Not the polite quiet of an audience. The quiet of 60 people who have stopped performing attention and are simply paying it. Judge Voss looked at both tables. "We'll recess for 2 hours," she said, "and then I'll give my ruling." The 2 hours were the longest Wren had spent in recent memory. They sat in Della's kitchen with Pruitt and Pemberton and eventually Virgil Greer, who had nowhere else to be, and Della produced coffee and something that was approximately pie, and they talked about other things. The price of timber, the coming winter, the condition of the mountain roads in October. They talked about these things with the mutual understanding of people who are all thinking about the same thing and have agreed collectively to give it room. At one point, Colt went outside. Wren followed without deliberating about it. He was standing in Della's small back garden with his hands in his pockets looking at the sky. She stood beside him. "Garrett's in there," he said, "in the waiting room." "I know. I don't know what he wants. I think he wants to know how it ends," she said. "And I think part of him wants it to end a certain way. Not Garnett's way. No," she paused. "Not Garnett's way." "He raised me," Colt said, and the words carried the weight they always carried when he said them, the weight of something that was true and remained true even when it was also painful. "I know," she said. "I didn't think he was capable of this. People make bad choices when there's enough money involved." She looked at the sky alongside him. "That doesn't make it forgivable. It makes it understandable. Those aren't the same thing." "No," he agreed. She turned to look at him. "Whatever happens in that room," she said, "we came with the truth. Pruitt's records and Virgil's box and Garnett's own words out of his own mouth. We didn't manufacture anything. We didn't pay anyone. We came with what was actually true. And if it isn't enough," he said, "then we appeal. We find more people like Virgil and we keep going." She held his gaze. "We are not running out of the truth. We have as much of it as we need." He looked at her in the October light, the particular flat gold light of late autumn at altitude, and his expression was the open one, fully arrived at, nothing held back. "Wren," he said. "Yes," she said. He reached up and touched her face, his thumb against her cheek, just there, just briefly, and looked at her with the full weight of everything that had happened between a June morning and this October afternoon. "Whatever happens today," he said, "I want you to know that this." He paused. "That you are." He paused again. She waited. "The day you fell off Opal," he said finally. "That was the first time I laughed since Nora died. The first time it felt like something I was allowed to do again." Her throat was tight. "You're allowed," she said. "You have always been allowed." He lowered his hand. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then Pemberton appeared at the back door. "She's called us back," he said. They went in. Judge Voss's ruling took 14 minutes. It covered 6 legal points, several of which Wren did not fully follow, and Pemberton explained afterward. But the conclusion was plain. Garnett's survey was found to be insufficiently documented to supersede the county's existing recorded boundary. The boundary would remain as Pruitt's original survey described it. The boundary claim was denied. The water channel built on Reardon land remained on Reardon land. Furthermore, given the testimony regarding the water diversion, and Garnett's own admission as corroborated by 4 named witnesses, the court found sufficient grounds for a separate legal action regarding unlawful diversion of a natural water source, should the affected party choose to pursue it. The gavel came down. Fitch was already leaning toward Garnett when the sound finished. Garnett's face held the expression of a man recalculating something he had been certain of and discovering the calculation does not work. Virgil Greer sat in his seat for a moment before he stood. He put both hands on his box of records, and he looked at it, and Wren, watching him from across the room, saw the exact moment when 12 years of waiting became something he could set down. His shoulders changed, not dramatically, but they changed. She turned to Colt. He was already looking at her. "We won," she said. "We won," he agreed. He stood and pulled her to her feet and held her hands in both of his, right there in the middle of the clearing courtroom with Pruitt shaking Pemberton's hand and Virgil carefully repacking his box and the 60 people in the gallery beginning to talk all at once. "What do you want to do?" Colt said. His voice was low for her. "Go home," she said without hesitation. The words sat between them. Home. It fit in a way it had not on the first evening when she had stood in the yard of Black Spur Ridge looking at the mountains and tried to find a name for the place she had arrived at. It fit because it had grown to fit the way things do when you work on them together, daily, through difficulty, until the shape of them becomes so familiar that you stop noticing when you stopped being a stranger to it. "Home," he agreed. Garrett was at the courtroom door when they came through it, hat in hand. The expression of a man who has arrived at an understanding too late, but has arrived at it honestly. He looked at Colt with something that was not quite remorse and not quite apology, but contained the genuine substance of both. Colt looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Come to supper Sunday. Come up the mountain." Garrett blinked. "There are things to say," Colt said. "We'll say them, but not today." Garrett nodded once. He put his hat back on. He left without speaking. Wren looked at Colt. That was generous. He raised me, Colt said simply. Badly and with his own interests too much in the picture. But he raised me, he paused. You said you can forgive someone and know they were wrong at the same time. I did say that. Seems like a reasonable approach, he said. They rode home in the late afternoon, the mountain road climbing steadily beneath them and the world feeling different in the way it feels different when something large has been decided. Not louder or brighter, but more settled, more fully itself. Flint was at the gate when they came through it, as he always was, and he greeted Wren first, pressing his great gray head against her hand. And then Colt, and then turned and walked toward the house ahead of them with the authority of a dog who considers the matter of welcome to be entirely under his management. He always does that, Colt said. Greets you first. He has good judgment, Wren said. Colt looked at her sideways. He does, he agreed, and the way he said it had nothing whatsoever to do with the dog. She went inside to start the fire while he took Drum to the barn, and she stood in the kitchen of the house that had been hers now for nearly 4 months and let herself feel the full weight of the day, the ruling in Virgil's face and Colt's hands holding hers in the middle of the courtroom, and the word home spoken between them in the plain way of something that was simply true. She had not let herself feel it in the courtroom. She had been practical in the courtroom, hands steady, voice level, mind on what was needed. But here, alone in the kitchen with the fire starting to catch and the mountains going dark outside every window, she let it arrive completely. She put the kettle on. She pressed both hands flat against the counter and breathed. Colt came in when she was pouring the coffee. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because the room held everything they had been through, and the silence was big enough to hold it all without straining. Sit down, she said. You've been on a horse and on your feet in a courtroom all day. He sat. She put coffee in front of him, and he wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the table, and Flint arranged himself in front of the wood stove with the expression of a dog who considered this entire outcome personally satisfying. Colt had arranged the settlement 2 weeks after the ruling, Garnett having accepted terms negotiated by Pemberton that included compensation for 3 years of diverted water. Wren discovered the details when Pemberton mentioned them in correspondence, and what she discovered first, the detail that stopped her mid-sentence when she read it, was that Colt had set up the bank account before they left for the hearing, before the ruling, before any of it was decided. He had established an account in both their names while he was still packing the saddlebag. Before, she had said when she found out. You arranged it before we went. Before we left, he confirmed. Before the ruling, he looked at her steadily. Whatever came out of it was ours, both of us. That's how I wanted it set up. She had looked at him for a long moment and had not been able to find the words for what she wanted to say, which was not something that happened to her often, and so she had simply looked at him until he understood from looking back at her that she had heard him completely. They had written to Virgil Greer about the settlement together, Colt drafting it and Wren going over it for precision, and the letter had included an offer to direct a portion of the compensation toward the strip of land Garnett had taken from Virgil 12 years ago. The land was still in Garnett's hands, but money could do things that a court ruling could not always reach. Virgil's reply arrived on a Thursday. Wren read it alone at the kitchen table. He had written that his son Hank was in Denver working in lumber and had mixed feelings about that occupation now that he understood more of his father's history. He wrote that Hank was thinking about coming home. Not sure what home looks like now, he had written. But Dad seems to think it's worth finding out. He had mentioned an orchard. I haven't stopped thinking about it. She sat with the letter for a long time. Outside, Flint moved on the porch, and the horses were quiet in the barn, and somewhere above the ridge a hawk was working the last of the afternoon thermals. She thought about what it meant that a man in Denver was thinking about coming home because of something that had happened in a Wyoming courtroom, because of a box of records kept for 12 years by a father who believed someone would eventually come and ask. She thought about the chain of it. Thomas Calloway's debt, Garrett's arrangement, a wedding no one had asked for, a water channel dug in 11 days, a letter from a man willing to break a non-disclosure agreement because he had been waiting 12 years for exactly this. All of it connected. All of it building toward something none of them had seen clearly at the start. She was still sitting with this when she heard Colt come in from the barn. Garrett came on a Sunday, as Colt had said he could. He rode up the mountain road on his good horse and tied it at the post and stood on the porch with his hat in both hands and the look of a man who has rehearsed something and is no longer certain any of it applies. Wren let him in. She put food on the table because food was the language of this house, and she was not going to change that for anyone. They sat, the three of them. Garrett looked at the kitchen, at the straight rows of the garden visible through the window, at the notebook on the shelf where Wren kept the ranch records. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man looking at something he had a hand in starting and something else entirely at the same time. I knew about the survey, Garrett said finally. Not the filing, but the survey. Before I wrote to you about it. Colt said nothing. I told myself it would resolve differently. That Garnett would use it as leverage and back off when pushed. He set his fork down. I told myself a lot of things. You needed me to have something to lose, Colt said. Yes. The word came out flat and honest and cost him something to say. You'd been dead up here for 7 years. A man with nothing to lose is no use to anyone, including himself. He looked at Wren briefly and then back at his plate. I thought the arrangement would be good for you too. I believed that. You talked yourself into believing it, Colt said. That's a different thing. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said, it is. The kitchen held the silence. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees on the ridge and Flint shifted on the porch. What can I do? Garrett said finally. Colt looked at his uncle across the table. The same table where Wren had found the contract. The same table where the water channel had been planned, and Virgil Greer's letter had been read, and 100 meals had been eaten by 2 people learning to be in the same house together. Tell me about the timber rights, Colt said. You said this place was worth more than I knew. Tell me what you know. Garrett blinked. He had clearly expected something else. Punishment, perhaps, or a reckoning that went longer and cut deeper. The northern timber, Garrett said slowly after a moment. There's a logging operation that's been buying rights in the county for 2 years, quietly. Your acreage up in the high range is exactly what they're looking for. Pitch pine and spruce, good elevation access. How long have you known this? 2 years, Garrett said. Colt was very still for a moment. Then he said, write me the names of the people in the logging operation. Everything you know about them. Ethan, write me the names. Garrett produced a small notebook from his coat pocket and wrote 3 names in his careful hand and tore the page out and put it on the table. Colt picked it up. He folded it. He put it in his shirt pocket. I'll need time, Colt said, before things are as they were. He paused. I don't know if they'll be as they were, but come back in the spring. Garrett looked at him with the expression of a man waiting for a door to close and finding that it has not. Bring Mabel, Colt added. Mabel will want to come, Garrett said quietly. She likes your. He stopped and looked at Wren. She likes you. She said it at the wedding. She said you were the kind of woman who looked at a situation and saw what it actually was. Wren looked at him for a moment. Tell her thank you, she said. And tell her spring is a good time. The garden will be worth seeing. Garrett left an hour later and the house held the particular quiet of a difficult thing that has been faced and is now at least faced. Colt sat at the table for a while after. Wren cleared and washed and let him sit. All right, she asked when she was done. Yes, he said, and then no. But I will be. That's honest, she said. I learned that from someone, he said. She hung the dish towel. She turned around and looked at him at the table, and he was looking at her the way he had been looking at her since the courtroom, since her hand in his on the wagon seat, since the back garden of Della's boarding house when he had touched her face. There's something I need to ask you, he said. Her heart did something she chose not to name immediately. Ask, she said. He stood up. He was very tall in the kitchen in the lamplight, and he put his hands in his pockets the way he did when he was working out how to say something that mattered. The arrangement, he said. The way this started. The debt in Garrett's letter, and none of it was what I'd have chosen if I'd had the choosing of it. He looked at her steadily. I know that, and I know you didn't have the choosing of it either. I know, she said. What I'm asking, he said, is whether you'd have chosen it if it had been a choice. He held her gaze. If you'd met me not like this, not the way we met, if you'd met me somewhere ordinary and had a real choice in front of you. He paused. Would you have chosen this? The question sat in the kitchen between them. She thought about it the way it deserved to be thought about. Not quickly, not to give him what he needed to hear, but actually. She thought about the man she had seen at the altar in 11 minutes of counted vows. She thought about the man who had put wildflowers in a blue jug and told her the door had a bolt on the inside. She thought about the paddock and the water channel and a filly named June and a dog who followed her everywhere, and Virgil Greer's box of records and a courtroom and her hand in his on the wagon seat coming home. Yes, she said, I would have. It might have taken longer. She held his gaze. But yes, he breathed. I'm not the easiest person, he said. No, she agreed. You think before you speak, and you go quiet when something's hard, and you work through problems alone before you'll ask for help. And you've spent 7 years building walls that are now somewhat inconvenient. She paused. I know, and he said, and I'm a woman who counted minutes in a church and learned to build water channels and argue with Boyd Garnett in her own yard. She looked at him directly. I'm not looking for easy, I never was. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and he kissed her, not carefully, not tentatively. The way a man kisses someone when he is done being afraid to, when the thing that has been building for 4 months has run out of room to be anything but itself. She kissed him back. When they drew apart, his forehead rested against hers and his hands were on her face and she could feel him breathing and she thought, this is what it was building toward. All of it. From the church to the mountain to the wildflowers in the blue jug to this kitchen, this moment, this man. Wren, he said. I know, she said. I love you, he said, with the particular simplicity of a man who has thought about something long enough that saying it comes out whole and plain and needing nothing added to it. She pulled back just enough to look at him. I love you too, she said. In case that wasn't clear, something in his face completed itself. It was becoming clear, he said. Becoming, she said. You're not subtle. He laughed, the full version, sudden and unguarded, the one that changed his face entirely, and she felt it in her own chest, The bright particular joy of being the person who could do that, who could reach the man underneath the years and the loss and the distance and make him laugh like that, genuinely and without armor. Flint, from in front of the wood stove, made a sound of supreme satisfaction and put his chin back on his paws. Later that evening, Colt went to the back room. She heard him in there for a few minutes, moving quietly, opening something, and then he came back to the main room with one of the small books from the trunk she had found months ago when she was learning the house, slim and worn at the corners in the way of books that have been read many times, and then set carefully aside. He sat down across from her at the table. He opened it to the page that fell open most easily, the page of a poem about light, about the way morning light arrives after a long dark and what it means to wake and find it still there, still arriving, the same as it had always been. He read it to her. His voice was not a performer's voice. It was his voice, low and careful and slightly rough at the edges. And he read the way he said everything that mattered, plainly, without decoration, letting the words be what they were without trying to make them anything more. She listened with her eyes closed. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. She was right, Wren said, about the poetry. He set the book on the table. He looked at the cover. I couldn't read it for a while, he said. After she died, I'd open it to that page and I couldn't get through it. She waited. I can now, he said. She understood what he was saying. She understood all of it, the grief and the years and the door that had been shut and was now standing open. And she understood that she was part of why it was open, and she received this with the seriousness it deserved. Read me another one, she said. He looked up. The expression on his face was the most open she had ever seen it. Nothing held back, no management, no distance. Just the man sitting across from her in the lamplight with a book of his dead wife's poetry and a gray dog asleep on the floor, and 4 months of becoming something neither of them had planned. He opened the book. He read her another poem, and then another, his voice low in the quiet room, and outside the October dark settled over Black Spur Ridge, and the horses moved in the barn in June, just weeks old, and already certain of her place, made a small sound that carried through the still air, and Flint breathed slow and even in front of the fire. Wren sat with her hands folded and her eyes closed and thought about everything that had brought her here. A father's debt and a stranger's proposal and a mountain she had never seen and a room with a bolt on the inside of the door. She thought about 11 minutes of vows and a blue jug with wildflowers and a laugh she had not been expecting and cold water running through a channel they had built together. She thought about a courtroom full of people and an old man with a box of records and a word spoken on a wagon road coming home. She thought, here, this is it. This is what it was all building toward. Not the courtroom, not the water channel, not even the moment he had kissed her in this kitchen. This. A lamp and a table and a man she loved reading poetry in the only voice that had ever been his, in a house that had been impossible and was now so entirely and unmistakably home that she could not remember anymore what home had felt like before it. She had come up this mountain with nothing but a straight spine and a jaw that did not tremble. She had not needed anything else. She had built everything else, not alone, not without him, but she had built it. Both of them had, daily and without fanfare, the way you build anything that lasts. Outside, the mountains sat in the October dark as they always had, enduring, patient, indifferent to human trouble in the way that only very old things can afford to be indifferent. They had been standing before either of them arrived and would be standing long after, but inside the lamp burned and the fire held and Colt's voice continued in the quiet room, and the sound of it was the sound of a man who had been closed for 7 years and was now in the most ordinary and extraordinary way open. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was, in every way that mattered, everything.